Hey there, race fans. It's Nathan Brown for another episode here of the Inside Line, joined as always by my co-host, Joey Barnes. We've got a lot to talk about in today's episode, recapping Mid-Ohio. If we have time, we'll take a little bit of a look ahead to the doubleheader this weekend at Iowa Speedway. We've got maybe our first battle truly as teammates between Scott Dixon and Alex Palou on track this weekend at Mid-Ohio. Got a lot of interesting off-track things to talk about, you might say, between silly season, what has happened at Team Penske this year, just in terms of the off-track stuff. And then we've got, I think both Joey and I have some thoughts on what came to be of the whole Josef Newgarden situation from Saturday and Sunday at Mid-Ohio. We'll both give some thoughts on that as well. But we'll start with the on-track stuff and the great performance from Scott Dixon that we saw this weekend at Mid-Ohio. He picks up win number 59 of his career, extends some pretty impressive streaks, including 21 straight seasons with a victory and 23 seasons overall in his career with at least one. Records that, when you really start to think about it, are certainly not going to be touched for quite some time. And frankly, I'm not sure, unless say a guy like Alex Palou stays around in this series for another 20 years or so, I'm not sure we're ever going to see someone touch those. What was it like, Joey, watching another one of these Scott Dixon masterclass fuel save efforts that we witnessed from your vantage point on Sunday?
So for a while, it kind of felt like the way that everything has felt over the past month. Like I thought we were running into a scenario where like Scott Dixon executed a lot of things well, but I was like, is this going to be another Road America? Is this going to be like, it just seems like he's always in the mix over the past 4 or 5 weeks, but he's always behind Kirkwood or he's behind Palou, and there was always something that was kind of amiss. I mean, so it was kind of interesting to see how this played out in a very unique way with the rare mistake. I believe it was in turn 9 by Palou, that allowed Dixon to effectively get the jump and go from 3 seconds back, I think, at the time.
I think it might have been 4. I had in my notes that it was 4. Yeah.
4 seconds back. And, it's a fast part of the track, what turn 9 is, and just, was able to execute that. What I think what was kind of interesting was the fact that it's after he got around Palou. Palou was able to gather it back up and reassert himself into the fight. And to see Dixon, who was less on tires, less on fuel, because he went for the under and all that stuff, and on that different strategy too, just didn't waver. So it's kind of interesting. And, with that, we've got to ask some questions in terms of, more, they're not even questions at this point. It's curiosities, statements of Dixon's legacy and how far it really goes. But, for my money, how do I say this in a very polite way? The race wasn't overly entertaining, to be blunt, but it was bookended with some drama at the start and at the finish. And overall, both of those things were really, really intriguing to me.
Yeah. So this was Dixon's first win since Detroit of last year. If you remember, he got off to a fairly decent start to the year. He finishes 3rd in the 500. He wins at Long Beach, wins that wacky race at Detroit with so many cautions and yellow flags to speak of. And then kind of, I imagine that at that point, I don't remember exactly where the championship stood, but I have to think he was at least kind of somewhat in the mix there. And then just kind of petered out of the picture a little bit. He finishes 6th in the championship, which I believe was, if he'd finished 6th 1 year before, that was 2016 as I'm looking at results. And outside of Chip Ganassi Racing's really off year in 2005, where they were battling with some woes with Toyota, and he finishes 13th in points and finishes 10th in points in 2004, which is, I think, kind of around that same time frame. That's at the start of his career. Other than that, he's virtually always in the top 4, top 3 in the championship. Most of the time, always in the top 3 with some minor exceptions. So had a little bit of a down end to that year. And then we just kind of been waiting for the season to feel like it was going to pick up. He finishes runner-up at St. Pete. It was a race that he certainly felt, and I think a lot of folks felt like was Dixon's race to win. He had that weird radio malfunction where he comes in a lap later than he wanted to. Basically was just having to follow the fuel light on his car instead of being able to communicate with his timing stand and Chip Ganassi Racing managing director, Mike Hull, to understand when was going to be the good point, when he was going to run into back markers or lap traffic. And that one extra lap that he ran where Alex Palou goes and undercuts him, and then they blend after their final stop, and Palou has jumped him in that pit sequence. And Dixon just didn't quite have enough to fight him. It looked like he was going to end up third that race, and then Josef Newgarden had an issue with his fueling in his final stop, and Dixon is able to pass him as Josef limps home in that race to finish third. But there just hadn't been, maybe outside of Gateway, a race where Scott Dixon had factored into the picture at all. He finishes 10th at Thermal, 8th at Long Beach, 12th at Barber, and a remarkable 12th place finish at Barber 2, given where he qualified. 5th on the IMS road course. He has his early brake fire in the 500, and that car is never really the same. He finishes 20th there, 11th at Detroit, goes and finishes 4th at Gateway, kind of forces his way into the picture there, I think, with some timely cautions that worked his way. And then with maybe one more caution at Road America late in that race, could have figured something out and maybe eked out a win there against Alex Palou. But otherwise, it's been a weird year. I feel like we're talking about Scott Dixon for maybe not the first time, but the first time in a long time on this podcast, which is just a weird thing to think about, knowing his legacy and his resume and his career. Again, win 59 for him, 21 straight seasons with a win. One thing that you touched on and kind of hinted at it a little bit. So with this 59th win of his, he now sits 8 behind AJ Foyt's record of 67 in AJ's career. And every one of these that he ticks off, you just start to wonder a little bit more if that record is going to be within reach for Scott Dixon. He turns, I think in a week or two, he turns 45. So we're certainly a lot closer to the end of his career than the beginning. He's been asked several times about, how long do you want to do this? And his answer is always, I want to do this until either I don't feel like I'm competitive, I don't feel like I have what it takes, or I'm not enjoying it. And I think both of those things are still very much part of Scott Dixon's psyche. So I'll ask you, Joey, you look at where he is, what the sport is like, how tough it is to pick up wins. Do you feel like Scott Dixon has 8 more wins in him in his IndyCar career?
I do. I actually think that he might have 10 more wins in his career, if I'm being blunt. And it's not because, it's not matching AJ would be great. I think that there's also a hunger to break AJ's record.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the same way that we've seen Will break Mario Andretti's pole record, right? And, so I look at this and I understand how hard it is to win, and I understand where things sit. But when you see how Ganassi is just incredibly quick as an organization right now, I think that has to play a factor into it. And I think the other end that needs to be factored in is the fact that, he's still competitive. He's still enjoying it. And yeah, he's 45, but he's cut from a different cloth. He's not a racer that's going to retire when he's in his 30s, right? He's a guy who you could see racing well into his 50s. And then, if he's 50, 51, and then he's like, what, I think I'm going to go and taper off and go race sports cars and pull a Scott Pruitt and do that for another, dozen years. I think all of that's fair play because I just think he loves it that much. So a 21st consecutive season with a win, is a remarkable stat. Chasing AJ is remarkable. I think he's a guy that could easily as he's got one win in the bag this season now at Mid-Ohio, fittingly Mid-Ohio. A year ago with the hybrid debut, let's not forget that he was in the hunt for the championship, and that's kind of what pulled it off the rails completely. And before the race even began, under the pace laps, he was the first victim of that unfortunate situation. So it's kind of cool that he gets a little bit of payback for it. Here a year later, and he's sitting fourth in the championship now, and we've still got 7 races to go. I don't think it's out of the question he can bag another 2 wins potentially this year, honestly. And if you're looking at that, you're like, okay, well, even if he's racing until he's 48 or 49, if he only wins 1 to 2, and I think that's the trick is if he races another 4 years, 5 years in IndyCar and averages anywhere between that, I think he's going to get it, and I think he's very capable, incredibly quick driver. And I think just like we said, I think in the last show that we had, we were talking about willpower, being able to go out on his own terms is my opinion. And, he gets to say when he wants to be done kind of thing, because he's earned that right with the legacy he's built and the things he's done. And I think Scott Dixon's the same way.
So I'm looking back at Scott Dixon's, let's say roughly, maybe not quite the last 2 decades, but close. So you take out those kind of bleak Toyota years, and outside that, there have only been 2 years in Dixon's, let's say, last 2 decades or so, where he's only won 1 race. That is 2017. He won a race at Road America, did not win otherwise that season, and then 2021 he won at Texas 3 races into the year and then did not win again. So outside that, he wins at least 2 races, many of them 3. And so for that, I look at this schedule and I think maybe outside the 3 Penske drivers and Pato and maybe Colton and Kirkwood, I'd say Dixon has just as good a shot of winning one of these short oval races that we have the rest of the year as any of those guys. I think he's got a better shot at winning one of them than Alex Palou, quite frankly. We saw Alex win the 500, but I still feel like Dixon's just got a little bit better handle at those races than Palou, or maybe they're about on a level playing field. And then you've got races that, yes, his teammate Alex Palou has been great on historically between Toronto, Laguna, and Portland. But Dixon has had, in those years where Alex has either won or finished on so many podiums at those 3 tracks, Dixon has been incredibly strong as well. You look at his, his last 3 Toronto races since we came back post-pandemic: 1st place, 4th place, 3rd place. You look at Laguna Seca, he was 6th last year. He won the race in 2023, was a little bit off in 2022, finished 12th, was on the podium. That different race. And you look at Portland, let's go since 2021. He was finished 3rd, and then he got eliminated early in the race last year and finished 28th. So I look at those 3 tracks, and I think that there's certainly a chance that Scott Dixon wins one of those. And then, I feel like this could potentially be a little bit of a season like he had in 2023, where he gets down to the final 4 races of the year and had not won a race yet. And we were starting to wonder if those 2 streaks that we had mentioned were going to go away, and then he wins 3 of the last 4 races of the year. I think there's definitely a chance that he hits that 3 race win mark this year. And then, then you're 6 away. Then at that point, I feel like this is absolutely in reach. I think we'll know in these last couple years, or in these next maybe 1 to 2 years, if this is in reach. It feels like it still is now, because it's hard to imagine a season where Scott Dixon doesn't win at least 2 races. And I do think he still feels like he loves this and is enjoying it. And it is also competitive now. Yes, he hasn't had a rotor street course pole in God knows how long. but he's always, there or thereabouts. It's very rare the weekends that he's not at least in the Fast 12, and there's a lot of weekends when he's in the Fast 6, and you always come into a race like we did on Sunday when he started 8th or 9th. You just always feel like there's going to be a way for Scott Dixon and Mike Call to manufacture a way to figure out how to get toward the front, and then you just need a break or two to go your way and things work out. So I think we'll know in a year or two. He'll either still be on this clip of winning 2 a year, and at that point he'll be within 4-ish races or so of AJ, if not closer, or if the wins just kind of start to fall off, maybe he doesn't win a race the rest of this year, maybe he doesn't win one at all next year, then that's kind of the point where you start to wonder if the performance is falling off enough to where maybe he starts to not enjoy this as much. Maybe he feels like from his vantage point, he's doing everything he can do, and it's just not quite there for him. I guess the thing will be really interested to see is if he sticks around for this, as IndyCar phases into this new car, that's going to be a little bit different, that everyone is going to have to learn and figure out a little bit, from teams to drivers to engineers. That's the type of situation that I feel like, Scott Dixon is amazing at. We think back to the introduction of the aero screen, and Scott Dixon wins the first 3 races of that year with Michael Cannon on his stand. That season in 2028 is going to be so much, I think, favoring the teams like a Team Penske or Chip Ganassi Racing or Air McLaren or Andretti Global, that have so much resources and have so many of the great people, whether it be engineers or mechanics, or research and development folks in this sport. Not to say that that's very different from what we see right now, in a year where only 3 drivers have won and only 1 manufacturer has won. But I just think the spread will be a little bit more in favor to those deeper teams, and that could potentially be a situation, as long as he is still around in this sport, where I think Scott Dixon could definitely shine. It's going to be a little bit of a lighter car. The addition of the hybrid has not been kind to the way in which Scott Dixon has grown used to driving a race car. He's talked a little bit about that. So I think a lighter car could certainly help him. And then it will just come down to whether he's still got the raw pace on Sundays and whether enough things fall his way, and we'll see. But that'll be something really exciting to watch over the next couple of years, because we just don't see things like that very often. We saw Will break Mario's pole record a couple years ago. Forever felt like that was something that was never going to get broken in the sport, and now we've got AJ's win record. I can't remember off the top of my head who he snagged that from, but I have to think that it was probably in the 30s or 40s at that point, when AJ took control of that and then tacked on another 20 to 25 wins. It's hard to imagine wherever this ends up, whether it's still in AJ's hands or if it's in Dixon's hands, who is going to be able to break this. Alex Palou obviously is someone that comes to mind, but outside that, these records that we're seeing either broken or challenged in this sport seem like they very well could stay for some time.
No, 100%. And, so we'll see what transpires with that. I want to transition real quick on something though. And that's, I want to look at the rest of this race real quick. And that's, we talked about Dixon and Palou. Christian Lundgaard had a good comeback after a couple of tough race weekends and got on the podium. So a positive for him. And Arrow McLaren got Colt Herta, Pato Award, Felix Rosenquist, Marcus Armstrong. That's your top 7. And then we've got Kirkwood, VK, and Kiffin Simpson rounding out the top 10 after a good qualifying run of 3rd for him. Good qualifying weekend for quite a few folks. And, if all of these guys are typical names that anticipate being in the mix, but something that's kind of been unique to this year is none of those drivers we just mentioned are Penske drivers. So it's kind of unique on what's going on. They all had miserable qualifying runs too, of 18th or worse, led by Newgarden there on Saturday, and it went off the rails quick on Sunday. And the fact that Josef, I don't know if kind of outbroke himself. I know he said something in his rare interview with TV that something just didn't necessarily feel right. And then
it sounded like, I think he thought that he had a brake lockup, I think is what he mentioned there. So I don't know enough about that. If there's something that was potentially set up wrong in the car from a brake pressure or a mechanical standpoint, or if it was a mistake from Josef, it's probably not any one thing. When you see something like that, he even was, I think, a little unsure on if he got tapped from behind. I haven't seen any video footage that would say definitively that he did or did not. This is another goes back to a long frustration of mine that not every one of these cars has an onboard camera. I think it's ridiculous that it's basically, I won't go too deep into this, but it's, basically, for whatever reason, I've been told there's only capabilities and equipment, I think, for like 14 drivers. And so those turn into whichever sponsors or teams are willing to foot the bill for that. And it is 10 of them or more are the same group every single weekend. And then you've got a couple that shuffle, maybe go back and forth between Connor Daly and Stingray, or Graham and Louis Foster, or Felix or Marcus Armstrong. I think kind of go back and forth on that. But Graham would be the only person, I think, that could have potentially gotten into the back of him. And I don't get the sense that happened, but it's still hard to know for sure. But yes, a very weird situation there for Josef, given everything that had transpired in the last 24 hours or so before that. And again, we won't jump to that right away. I still think there's a lot to talk about, just in kind of putting some numbers and some trends toward what we've seen out of Team Penske throughout the season that really harkens back to some of the worst seasons that we've ever seen from this team, several of which are kind of bunched up there in the 90s and the kart era, that I know you were maybe a little bit more in tune with than I was in my early racing years.
Well, and what's kind of wild about this race weekend too is, just to put a bow on this weekend in general with Penske's performances, 10 laps after Josef has his incident on the opening lap, Will Power has a mechanical issue, fire extinguisher and everything surrounding that car, and trying to get that down because they had some sort of mechanical issue there. And he called it terminal with the engine whenever he talked to IndyCar radio. And then Scott McLaughlin may have set the fastest lap of the race, but it was also a miserable weekend for him, and he ends up finishing 23rd, a lap down.
What happened to his race? Do you remember? I feel like I should know this, and I feel bad that I don't. But outside of qualifying really poorly, is there anything else that you can remember or think of that led to him finishing so far behind?
Not really. Honestly, I kind of half wondered, because that's something that wasn't necessarily highlighted very well by the broadcast. But it was just one of those it makes me wonder if he just like stalled exiting the pits maybe, or if it was just like missing something or just a brief off-track moment. But that part escapes me a little bit. But nonetheless, it's been an incredibly crazy year for Penske in general. I know we've talked about this ad nauseum the last few times, and because it is a huge deal, you went and did a deeper dive on inside the numbers for the way that this translates, for this year in particular. All the stuff you looked up was postcard era that I've recognized. So just kind of share a little bit of what you found, because this has become, in modern Penske history, certainly since the reunification, this has got to be the worst season in memory.
Yeah. So some of what I found, in part, what I looked up, the fact that it didn't go back to kart is because there just had been an instance of one of these things that had taken place. Since then, for example, the team is now at 5 straight races without a podium from all 3 of its drivers. The last time that took place was 2013. If we were to not see any of Team Penske drivers on the podium, race 1 at Iowa, and that stretch reaches 6 races. The last time they had 6 races without a podium across their team was 2004, and that was again a lot of those seasons until we kind of get into the 2010s were years where this team was only running 2 cars. So I feel like it's a little bit different when you've only got, if you go 4 or 5 races without 2 cars on a pole or on a podium, I think is a little bit different than having 3 cars. But again, we're just working with what we've got there. They now have an 11 race stretch consecutive without a win. The last time was when it reached 15 races from 2007 to 2008. They have now had 10 DNFs this year across their 3 cars, the most that a Team Penske program in IndyCar has had since 2000. And that was a year, let's see here. So that was a year, I think there was like a 20 race season where they were running 2 cars, and they had 13. We could very well see Team Penske not have any more DNFs this year. There's 7 races left, so 21 more starts across their cars. But I mean, the way this is all trending, and knowing how many ovals we have and what can happen on an oval, even when it is not anyone's fault, among Josef Newgarden, Scott McLaughlin, or Will Power. I mean, we've seen it. 2 of those things were mechanical that they dealt with at Worldwide Technology Raceway, and one of them was just Josef being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Certainly not his fault in that one, but they end up with 3 DNFs there. So it's hard to imagine that they want to have any more, and it wouldn't be impossible to see them come through with at least 3 more to match that. A couple other things that I dug up. So we've had 10 races through 2025, so that's 30 starts for this team. They've had 12 finishes outside of the top out of the top 20, as many as Andretti, Ganassi, and Aaron McLaren combined, and I think only a couple, maybe 1 or 2 fewer than Ray Hall, Letterman, Lanigan Racing. You think how the different place that you think of those 2 programs right now, or the ways in which we thought those 2 programs were incredibly different coming into this season, and frankly, how different they are in points. RLL has 3 cars, I think, sitting 20th or worse in points. Josef is down there in 19th, yes, but McLaughlin and Will Power are, I think, 9th and 11th, which is certainly not where they want to be or where they would hope to be or where we would expect them to be. But even they have had a handful of races that have just completely gotten away from them. And we are now at 3 straight races for Team Penske, so that being Mid-Ohio, Road America, and Worldwide Technology Raceway, where this team has not even had a top 10 finish among their 3 cars. There were 3 straight races as a 4-car team where this team in 2021 didn't had 3 of those cars finish outside the top 10, but it wasn't all the same cars, so I don't know that I would count that. And so then going back, there were 3+ race stretches where the team had finishes outside the top 10 as 2-car teams multiple times in 1998, but otherwise really no direct comparisons to just how frankly miserable this specific 3 race stretch that we've had over the last month or so has been for this team. Josef has gone 14 races without a win. The only longer streak that he has had in his career were between wins number 2 and 3 in his career, which lasted 15 races. So unless he gets a win here at Iowa Speedway this upcoming weekend, which is incredibly possible, if we, I don't know if we'll have time for it today, but if we were listing off guys that I think could be the favorite for this weekend, he would definitely be on my short list, no matter how the season has gone. But that basically says, unless he gets a win, this weekend at Iowa, and you take away the time in which it took him to pick up the first win of his career in, I believe, was it 2015, 2014 before he joined Team Penske. It's slipping me right now, but it'd be the worst stretch of his career. And I think it certainly feels that way. But he's had some ups and downs in his career, but just nothing that has been this extensive. I think there was another stat that Fox mentioned too about how many DNFs he's had over the last, I think 13 races. I think it's maybe up to, I think 6 of his last maybe 12 or 13 starts have been DNFs, and you have to go back to the start of his Team Penske career all the way back in 2017 to find the next 5 or 6. Just some really incredible stuff. And we were talking off pod before we got rolling here about how it's not been any one thing with this team either. That's I think the weirdest thing. There have been some races where they haven't had speed, but they're not always lacking speed. There have been some races where they've had freak mechanical things, but it's not just that these cars are poorly built. There have been some races where we've seen drivers make mistakes, but that has not always been the case. And then, of course, you have the 500, where outside of McLaughlin's big mistake on the parade laps, Josef and Will were probably cars that you could have expected to contend for the win, and then they are forced to start 32nd and 33rd for what took place with those cars in pre-qualifying tech with their attenuators that we don't need to dive into. But it's just been such a weird season, and frankly, really such a weird last couple months. And I know the moves that took place inside this team in losing, frankly, their entire leadership group and not having that directly replaced until what the team announced on Friday, which we can touch on here in a second. The engineers on those teams were essentially pulling double duty. They were the strategists, they were the engineers, they were the team managers in many ways. I just have to think there have been so many people that have been taking on additional responsibilities that they're just frankly not used to, that there just hasn't been enough focus on building perfect race cars and getting every single I dotted and T crossed. And I don't think this hasn't done nothing to the drivers' mentality and focus in these situations either. And it's just been a really weird confluence of situations and results for this team that you just don't ever see at the top of motorsport. We, those seasons that Team Penske went through in the 90s were years where there was so much manufacturer competition and the sport was kind of in a weird place, and driver, like, they were in a kind of a gap year or two in their driver market. It was at the end of the 10 years of Al Unser Jr. And Paul Tracy and Emerson Fittipaldi with those teams, and they weren't really able to find guys to replace them until they ended up landing on Gilles de Fer and what was supposed to be Greg Moore before he unfortunately passed away, and they landed on Helio Castroneves and kind of took off from there for that next era of Team Penske. It's just we don't ever see seasons like this from teams that you just expect across the board to win a championship, and they are so far away from thinking that they are in the realm of that at this point coming into this weekend.
Yeah, I think what it shows me is number one, first and foremost, people matter. The people a part of these race teams matter. And maybe Team Penske as an organization might have a deep bench, but I don't necessarily think that the IndyCar program had a deep bench, because now we're seeing where they're having to pull from. And you touched on it a little bit ago. And so 4 days ago, roughly, 4th of July, they announced a couple of changes at the top. Travis Law, who has been with the organization since 2007, done a lot of roles at Team Penske, has been named their competition director. And then Jonathan Newgood, if that name sounds familiar to all of you folks, He's been a part of the program. He was part of the replacements last year's month of May, whenever the other cast of characters that are no longer with the team were off doing serving their suspension. So,
but and also this year too.
Yeah, and this year, yeah, and so Jonathan Newgarden, led the Porsche Penske Motorsport program to the past 2 Daytona 24-hour victories and the Sebring title this year. Awesome person, really good, really smart. I think that the thing that I'm going to be fascinated with is just they've more or less been a rudderless ship in terms of leadership the past month and change, let's call it. I mean, we can even say 2 months really. And so you look at this and I kind of wonder if okay, this is the first weekend that we had where Dogood and Law were in their respective roles. And keep in mind, with Dogood in particular, he's more or less overseeing the entire program, I think, with the exception of the NASCAR team. I think he's highlighting IMSA. He's also doing the WEC. He's also doing IndyCar. So
I think both of them are too. I think both of them in their respective roles between president of Penske Racing and the competition director that Travis Law holds. I think they're both, if memory serves me correct, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're over both of IndyCar and the IMSA and WEC programs there. So they don't really even still have someone who's just focused at the top on IndyCar, which I think is an interesting decision. In some ways, I wonder if these decisions were kind of made in taking stock of what they had within the organization and making the best of what they had. I don't know that there was any, as I've been thinking about this over the last couple months, there wasn't really anyone that I could think of that made sense on the periphery of the sport, at least in IndyCar. It's not like there was, frankly, someone like a Kyle Moyer or just kind of floating around out there. I know a lot of people wondered if Gavin Ward would entertain going back there, and I really don't think, Gavin enjoyed being an engineer, or the short time that he got a chance to be the technical director or similar, whatever his role was at Air McLaren for 3 months before he filled in for Taylor Kyle and was kind of thrust to lead the top of that team. That wasn't something that he signed on to be. And frankly, from talking to Gavin a little bit, I won't share too much of that. But generally speaking, I don't think that that's anything that he really truly wanted to be, and not necessarily something that he, at least knowing Gavin like I do, I don't think he would ever go back and do something like that. That's just so demanding, and there's just a lot on the table for someone like that. And so I don't know that there's anyone that would make sense there.
Let me ask you this though.
Yeah.
We've got Dogood and we've got Law, and they're officially in their roles. So Team Penske officially has leadership at the helm now. Again, how long before they put their fingerprints on the IndyCar program, in your opinion, of when we see, we know it's realistically with what this team is capable of, this organization, the drivers, the talent they have, they can go and sweep Iowa. They can go and win Milwaukee and Nashville, and they can potentially do something again at Portland. They can win anywhere, any week, right? But they haven't, and they found ways to shoot themselves in the foot with various issues, self-inflicted or not. Self-inflicted, you make your own luck in many cases because of preparation or a lack thereof. How long do you think before their fingerprints are on this organization to the point that we're not seeing them make these mistakes that are so self-inflicted, because they have been in such high frequency this year?
Yeah, I think the rest of this season is really kind of just managing getting through as best as you can. One interesting thing that I found from, and it wasn't directly from the initial release that Team Penske sent out about about their leadership and about Travis and Jonathan, was the fact that neither of those two guys would serve in a strategist role on any of these three teams for the rest of the year. So that means ever since the dismissal of Tim Cindric, Kyle Moyer, and Ron Rzuski ahead of the 500, I believe Joseph's car and Will Power's car has had their engineers, being Luke Mason for Josef and Dave Faustino for Will Power, have those two gentlemen have been both serving as the race strategist and the race engineer. I think there was one race there where McLaughlin had Ben Bretzman doing both, and it was, if memory serves me right, maybe Gateway, which was an overlap with Lamar. Malcolm Finch, who had been maybe the assistant engineer at times on McLaughlin's car, is also part of the IMSA and WEC programs of Porsche Penske Motorsport. But in races where there hadn't been a conflict, Malcolm had been serving as McLaughlin's new race engineer, and his longtime engineer Ben Bretzman had been the strategist for the weekends. I imagine a lot of those, without having been in the in the transporters and in these team meetings that this team has had, I imagine a lot of those things, you're not thinking too much. There's maybe not as much for a strategist specifically to do outside of the race or outside of thinking what your tire management is going to be throughout a weekend. And so I bet it's not too overly demanding for someone like Faustino or Mason to do both of those roles. But I found it interesting that that they didn't insert themselves, whether it be Jonathan or Travis, into either of those roles to take some to take some things off of the plates of Luke Mason and David Faustino. I think there's maybe something to the idea that Josef seems like he has a really great tight-knit relationship with Luke Mason. And I think you can say the same for Will Power, who's been with David Faustino, since before his Team Penske days, I think, if memory serves me right, maybe. So maybe the argument there is to, they've been able to handle and kind of make do over the last couple races with someone who is very close to those drivers, and maybe it just makes the most sense to finish out the year with that, and maybe we see some changes there in the offseason. There's probably also something to the fact that both Jonathan Duguid and Travis Law still have to manage things on the IMSA and WEC side. That's something that we mentioned earlier. They don't have someone who is just overlooking the IndyCar program. Now, outside of the start of this year, Tim Cindric had always been in the same place. He had always been the president of the entire Penske racing regime, if you will. So he'd been in charge of, he had folks at the IndyCar level like Ron Rzuski and Kyle Moyer who reported up to him. I'm not going to remember the name of the guy on the NASCAR side. You might know, but I know there's been someone there for quite a long time who's been in place who would have reported up to Tim. And then you had obviously Travis and Jonathan on the sports car side that would have been reporting up to Tim. And then at the start of this year, Tim scaled back his responsibilities a little bit and was just in charge of the IndyCar side. And then you had Jonathan and the folks on NASCAR kind of all siloed in, looking after themselves, and you didn't anymore have one person atop. So I'll be interested to see, I guess, what a long-winded way of saying, I will be interested to see if Jonathan or Travis Law take any more of an active role on any of these three cars moving forward next year. I have to think that if they don't, that they would hire a strategist for the 12 car, whether that's Will Power driving that or David Malukas or someone else. And I would also think that you'd have someone else filling in for Luke Mason on Newgarden's car, just to take some workload off of those guys' plates. It's clearly something that they can do, but I don't know that that's the optimal way that you would run a race team. And frankly, it's why so many teams have a strategist who is not the lead race engineer. There are some teams that do it that way. I think of Palou's car, for example, who has Will Anderson, who's I think both his engineer and the guy who communicates to him. Kyle Kirkwood has Jeremy Millis, who is his engineer and I think is also his lead strategist. So there's some folks that do it both ways, and maybe they decide that this is the best way for them with who they have in place, and maybe there's not anyone that makes sense to hire from the outside to bring in, and maybe not someone who say could both do strategy and something else if they feel like they need to get more out of a person. There's not another opening on the team that makes enough sense to warrant hiring someone. I don't know. Those are some of the things that stand out to me when I absorbed this and we saw the release from Team Penske, and then also got the information of kind of how they would manage things for the rest of the season.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting to see how they are moving forward. I think for my money, to put a bow on this part, is if they can just minimize the self-inflicted wounds and minimize to the point that they're not having DNFs the rest of the year, which is wild to think because it's a team that we thought would be fighting for championships this year. If they can at least just stay out of their own way, I think that it's a win the rest of the way at this point. But with the way that this year has transpired with Team Penske, it's probably no wonder why it's got a particular driver of them maybe a little flustered. That might be an appropriate word to put to it, but it's certainly sparking some interest for a lot of the wrong reasons. And on Saturday became a pretty hot button topic among everyone, to the point that it filtered into Sunday, and even Fox made fun of it in their warm-up show with Cletus walking off. But you look at this, and Josef Newgarden didn't enjoy his qualifying run of 18th, and just decided, I'm not talking to the media. We're not doing a TV interview. Very similar to Road America, if you will. So, and this has become now a trend where when Josef is mad or Josef is upset or Josef doesn't feel like it, Josef doesn't do it. Keep in mind, his teammates will still talk to TV. They'll still handle things. When Scott McLaughlin had an awful qualifying run, he still ate it. He still took it and talked about it. He wasn't happy about it. He wasn't thrilled about it, but he did it. And there's a lot of opinions that you and I have over this. I think that two things can be true all at the same time. I think one, Josef is well within his right to not want to talk to us, to not want to talk to TV, not like it's a free country. At least that's what we're told. And so that, if you want to say no, you can say no, and that's fine. But I think that there's a flip side to this. It's the impact of your role within the sport, of whether you want it or not. You're viewed as the face of the sport. You're one of 3 commercials, spokesperson for the sport that's been played all over with Pato and Palou. There are kids that this sport's trying to gather, and this is the example that's set. There are sponsors that are supporting your efforts, and you're not giving them an opportunity with just you in a fire suit with those badged all over yourself in front of a camera. There's so many ways that this feels wrong to me. And it filters from being a role model, being the face of the series, or one of the faces of the series. For your sponsors, you're with Roger Penske's team, the guy who owns the series. It comes across arrogant, selfish, childish in many ways, I would say. The only reason why I say that, and I know that that's probably going to upset some people, is the fact that, maybe Josef didn't ask to be the face of the series. Maybe he's being propped up and he's being force-fed to you, and it's not even something he wanted. I know you wrote a good story about that a year ago, but I'll say this is that he is that person that Roger put front and center. He is the guy that is put under that and put in that role. And there's expectations and responsibilities that come with that. If you don't want that, that's fine. Then just say so and let somebody else take that mantle. Let Pato take the mantle. Let Palou take the mantle. I mean, hell, right now, the best American driver is Kyle Kirkwood, if I'm being honest. So you look at this, and he's got the right to say no. He can. But in this situation, when you're trying to grow a sport and you're trying to do things that improve it, and when you're trying to be a role model for others, I don't see how any of that is positive for the sport to move forward.
Yeah. I have lots of thoughts on this. I probably won't share all of them. I will share most of them. Part of what I want to do with this segment is, I don't know, try to do some educating for folks who don't entirely understand what our jobs and maybe misunderstand what our roles are in this sport. Because there's so much rhetoric getting thrown around on social media, and I know so much of that oftentimes is a loud minority. I think that's so often the case in social media. We see, just even in the realm of IndyCar, you and I, as much as we spend time on there, we hear things about ratings or thoughts about we need a new car or we should or shouldn't go to this track or that track. And sometimes those loud opinions can seem like they hold more weight and they're coming from a larger group of people than is actually the case. So taking all of this with a grain of salt, I do think this turned into a much larger talking point that had way more legs than I think it needed to. But I also think it's gives us an opportunity to hopefully do some explaining on things. And also, I think, quite frankly, clear up some narratives that I think have been misrepresented by some folks that I saw on social media. I'm not going to name any names, call any people out. I don't think it's necessary, but I want to do some, frankly, defending of some of the reporting around Josef and around Team Penske that has gone on by me and other upstanding folks in the IndyCar media, yourself included, that I just saw some things said by certain diehard fans of Josef on this weekend that I think are wide of the mark and unfair generalizations of things that either have not been written or said by folks that I think I would include in the core media of this sport, or have bled over from things that fans have said about Josef and gotten twisted into things that the media has written or said about Josef, or are instances of critical reporting that a lot of us have done over the goings on of Team Penske over the last couple of years that, you and I are both sports fans. We have our teams that we ride or die for. And if we're maybe a little bit unfair in the fact that we understand how the journalism and media industry works. So if we see a columnist write a scathing column or someone write a story that's got a whole lot of facts put into it, but is, generally written somewhat critically, I don't think you and I will get too up in arms as long as it's somewhat fair, and someone who's frankly just a fan of Josef who isn't really familiar with the media world maybe will come away from it a little bit differently. So I have a lot. Maybe the first thing I want to do on this is, again, clarify things that I said on social media that got a a lot of attention and a lot of responses. I'll go through some of the responses afterwards, but what I said on Saturday immediately after this took place, and again, this I believe marks the third consecutive time that Josef had declined, and frankly, didn't even acknowledge the presence of Fox's pit reporters in trying to ask him a question after qualifying. This is a very normal thing. If you watch FS1 or FS2 IndyCar broadcasts, even just this year, especially, the last several years, it is wholly routine of Jack Harvey and Georgia Henneberry and Kevin Lee to look at how round one in qualifying on a rotor street course panned out, and you immediately you go to the names of someone that you would have expected to move on from round one who didn't. Those are the first people that you are going to look to talk to. You're not talking to drivers who are still active because they are still in their car, because they've still got to go compete in the Fast 12, and they're watching replays of laps, or they're talking with their strategist or their engineer. So the pool of folks that you have to talk to between rounds one and between group one and group two in round one, and then between group two and the Fast 12 are only those people who just got eliminated. So you're probably doing two, maybe a maximum of 3 interviews in each of those segments. So you're going to be talking to guys who got bumped, so that that you would have expected to move on. So that's almost always going to be someone from Team Penske, or Alex Palou, or Scott Dixon, or Pato Ward, or Christian Lundgaard, or Felix Rosenquist, or Marcus Armstrong, or any of the 3 from Andretti Global. You look immediately to see if those guys advanced or not. If they didn't, those are going to be the first people you try and talk to. And then the next pool is probably someone who, maybe doesn't advance to the Fast 12 very often, that just missed it by a couple hundredths of a second. Maybe earlier in his rookie year, a guy like a Louis Foster at Ray Hall Letterman Lanigan Racing, or Graham Rahal, or Christian Rasmussen, or Alexander Rossi. That's kind of the next group of people. And for a team like Team Penske, who has struggled so much this year, to see a guy like Josef qualifying whatever it was, 18th or 19th for this race, immediately that is someone that you are going to want to talk to. There are some folks out there that think that those are completely pointless interviews. And yes, you might not learn much. And no, these are not groundbreaking. These are not end of the world. These are not, frankly, probably even quotes that almost anyone is going to write a story about. It might end up at the bottom of my qualifying story. But it is helpful for us as journalists to understand what happened. Because if you see 3 Team Penske drivers qualifying 18th, 21st, and 22nd, and we don't get to learn why, then we don't know what's going on. We don't know what the wider story. We don't know if they are struggling for speed. We don't know if one of them got held up, if one of them just kind of had an off that the TV cameras didn't catch in qualifying. If they're
a Newgarden fan, you should want to know why.
Yep, exactly, 100%. They are not always going to be illuminating, those 30 seconds that they're on TV. You're not going to get frankly, you're not going to get tough questions. Really, it's the first question is, hey, you didn't make it out of round one. What happened? And maybe there's going to be one follow-up question. If it is, I got held up, it's, do you think there should have been a penalty? Or if it was someone going off, it's what led you to go off? Or if it's a car problem, is this something that you've been dealing with all weekend, or is this something that just happened? Or maybe for someone in Josef or Team Penske's instance, if they've been missing out on Fast 12s for a couple weekends in a row, you say, is this similar to what you were dealing with at Road America or at the IMS Road Course? If there, are similarities here. It's not the most interesting stuff. It's not going to end up making a story all itself, but it helps tell the story of the sport and the story of that qualifying session. So that's why those questions are asked. Otherwise, we're just watching race cars go around in circles and listening to car audio. So it wasn't a story after Josef did it at Road America. Again, he also, I think, declined to talk to whoever would have been at the infield care center at Worldwide Technology Raceway after Josef crashed out of that race. I have less of an issue with that because I just think of everything that happened there to Josef. He's in position to feel like he can challenge for this race win, and gets clobbered to no fault of his own. Went through, frankly, a really scary incident there. The way in which he either was T-boned or got T-boned by Louis Foster and then was flipped upside down and doing all of that at 170 miles an hour or what it was. That's going to take a lot out of you. And yes, we would probably oftentimes still see a driver talk after that, but I don't fault him for either being frustrated or frazzled or just dejected enough to just feel like he wasn't in a space to talk at that point. That's fine. And we see a handful of drivers. It doesn't happen very often. But we see drivers every so often decline to talk to a pit lane reporter after they've gotten bumped out of qualifying. I've seen Alexander Rossi do it a time or two, but most of those instances that I'm thinking of is, they don't have an answer. They don't know what happened, and they are engaging in a conversation with their engineer to try to go over the data at that point, or maybe they're just too frustrated. And these drivers doing what they do and putting themselves at risk and the high adrenaline and everything it takes and the focus and the grit to do what they do, they're not always going to want to give some public comments immediately after hopping out of the car. But I would say 90% or more of what we see from a TV standpoint, those requests are granted. So, the fact that Josef took off on a scooter at Road America after qualifying where he did, not something that we've never seen before, something, notable, and something that, obviously stuck with a lot of us, remembered that it had taken place, but wasn't anything that anyone was talking about. It was the fact that these had happened multiple race weekends now in a row. And frankly, with Kevin, the visual of Kevin standing there and him saying that he audibly and clearly asked Josef twice, and Josef kept his eyes focused and trained on the ground, walked right by him, didn't acknowledge him, gets his scooter and takes off. It was again, the drivers owe us nothing. He's not obligated. There's nothing in the rule book that requires any driver to talk after qualifying. Well, that's not true. If you qualify really well, there's an obligation in the rule book that you go do the press conference, but can't imagine what situation there would take place that if you qualify first or second, that you're not going to want to go talk. So he does not have to, but there comes a point where Josef is not just employed to drive his race car. I saw some fans that were commenting online of, hey, his only job is to drive a race car. Anything outside that it's not his direct job. It's not what he was hired to do. And it's just not the case, because otherwise he'd be driving around in either a plain white, plain black, or plain blue fire suit. There's sponsors all over that fire suit. There's an obligation to represent and frankly, do appearances, whether it be in a 30-second pit lane interview in the, immediate aftermath of the good, bad, or the ugly in the sport, or going to, appearances or what have you to represent those sponsors as well as his team, as well as the series. Josef is also, like it or not, as you mentioned, he's the face or one of the faces of this sport, and he deserves to be that. He has won 2 championships. He's won 2 Indy 500s. There are, how many drivers in this sport is there? There's no other driver in the sport that has won multiple championships and more than 1 500. Scott Dixon hasn't. Palou hasn't. Will Power hasn't.
Not currently driving, no.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Not currently driving. He's the only driver who has he's climbed to the mountaintop on those 2 things in this sport multiple times. He drives for the biggest, winningest, most popular, maybe not most popular, but certainly the winningest and most historic team in this series. He's the most successful out of them, and he is the highest profile one. Like it or not, that's just where he is in this sport. And so for someone like that to kind of be a little standoffish like that and be so multiple times in consecutive races, it's notable. It's something,
and it's a trend because it's also happened multiple times throughout the previous few seasons too. Mm-hmm. I think that's the part that's also irritating, is the fact that, like, this, a few years ago it happened, and it's like, okay, cool. He's really passionate. He talks about he's really passionate. I appreciate the passion. I 100% appreciate the passion. And then he does it a little bit last year. And then this year, I can't remember if he did it after the 500 with his mechanical issue or not.
I can't remember if he did on TV or not. I know it wasn't me, but I know one of our reporters who was working for the Star did get some quotes from him. So I don't know if it was directly from talking to him at his pit box or if it was off of TV. So he did some sort of media after that. I do know that to be the case, but I know I think I was seeing floated that it had been like 40 plus days since Josef had done an on-camera interview for Fox. And granted, again, I still have more that I want to say and kind of clear up on this. Nowhere did I or anyone from a media standpoint say that Josef was not doing media. That's not accurate. It was not said because it's not accurate. I talked to Josef on Friday. I don't have there were some people that tried to make this out to be.
Well, he was in the bullpen on Friday. Yeah.
Yeah. There were some people that were trying to turn this into me or other people claiming that Josef just was not doing media. Or wasn't talking to me. I frankly, there's so many people insinuating things like that, or saying, I hope he doesn't talk to you for the rest of the year. That frankly, I wonder if there are people thinking that I work for Fox, which is obviously not the case. Because I, commented on this and then pointed out what was done on the warm-up show on Sunday morning. There were some people that were so felt so maligned by me literally watching a video clip and describing it in typing that up in a social media post and hitting send. Didn't really understand that. Thought that was a little weird. But I guess what I'm trying to get on all of this. So I said on social media that I think only being willing to talk when things aren't going well isn't a good look. And again, I think one of those, even two, if you want to stretch Road America and Gateway together, I think that's fine. I just think when it turns into a trend, and when it comes off, frankly, is disrespectful to someone like Kevin, who's been in the sport, who's earned folks' so much, the respect for the work he does, and the time he puts into his craft. I obviously don't know their personal relationship, but I can't imagine that Josef would have anything against Kevin. So that was disappointing. And again, these interviews are not pivotal. They are not make or break things, but it's how the game goes. It's the cadence of this. It's so that we in the greater media can tell the story of what is going on track and off track, good or bad. And it's important for us to be able to do that. Again, Josef doesn't owe us that, but it helps us do our jobs to be able to best understand what is going on and why things are happening. And that's why, for a sport like IndyCar that so badly needs and wants to grow and get bigger, more information is always going to be better. I know there were lots of people that were speculating about whether Josef was in a good mental headspace, and felt like doing an interview at that point was just something that he couldn't handle or do. And if that's the case, that's fine. Although I would argue that what happened to Josef on lap 1 at Mid-Ohio, in an instance where he did give an interview after coming out of the care center, had to have been, I would think, so much more frustrating than ending up qualifying 18th or 19th or wherever it was. So it's just weird. I wish this wasn't a storyline. I wish this wasn't something that got talked about, but and I didn't expect it to turn into this big thing. But I stand by what I said, in that I don't think it's the right way to go about things. I think there is a responsibility to someone who is one of the biggest names and faces and one of the most successful drivers of this sport to talk in those situations, even if it's a small thing like qualifying. It's just, it helps us do our jobs, and we want to be able to do that. And if they're not going to be hard-hitting journalism questions he's answering there, I'm, again, not trying to make it sound too trivial to where it shouldn't matter, because one instance doesn't necessarily, but as it piles up, it just becomes a little bit of something. But before I finish this, I do want to go over to clarify some things that some fans of Josef's put out there in terms of the narrative and the way in which Josef has been covered, that I just think are a little unfair. And I want you to chime in on any and all of these that you have something that you want to mention, because as two of the few folks that have been following this sport as closely as we have been over the last couple of years, I think I just want to make sure that we're as accurate on this as possible. But I saw someone say that Josef's character was assassinated by the media after Push to Pass. I can speak from my standpoint. I think we're very, I think I was critical and asked lots of questions in the aftermath of that. I think Josef's, the answers that he gave in his press conference, though I applaud him for getting up and sitting down and doing that press conference. I know it took a lot to do that. He was very emotional. It was obviously weighed on him a lot. There are just some inconsistencies in the way in which that team and Josef and his teammates explained all of that just frankly didn't and continue to not make sense. Josef claiming that he thought that the rules had changed when neither of his teammates thought that was the case. The simple facts that didn't get noticed by the team, when you know how much data teams go over on a given race weekend, and how much drivers across a team are communicating and their engineers are communicating, that was just weird. That's something that I will never fully understand. The fact that Josef thought that Josef and his engineer thought that it had been communicated that the push to pass rules that were in place for the $1 Million Challenge had been made across the entire season. For someone that is just so thorough and methodical about his craft, I didn't understand that. I'm not calling him an outright liar. That never made sense. And I think it's fair to admit that. The next thing, people pointing out or claiming that the media just lined up to write stories about how no one likes Josef. and that we went out of our way to go and hunt down his car in the museum earlier in May this year to check out his attenuator. The thing about drivers not liking Josef, those were on the in for me, and I remember doing a story about this. I mean, we asked probably half the paddock, has Josef talked to anyone? What is your view of Josef? What do you think about his explanation and his apology? And what was included in that story was accurate. I mean, they were almost entirely named on the record quotes from drivers. I can think of a couple in particular who were really unsettled and did not believe Josef and felt like, as competitors of his, that he was just not telling the truth and had been deceitful in what had taken place there. And those opinions may have gotten ironed out behind the scenes and changed, but there was, going into May last year, there was a significant portion of the IndyCar driver paddock that was not a Josef Newgarden fan, and told us that Josef had talked to very few of them and was really siloed off. Probably some, maybe a little bit.
I mean, Colton Herta was pretty outspoken.
100%.
Yeah, in that, and just saying that they were
Graham Rahal, Pato Ward. Again, I don't know that these are necessarily people that Josef is super close and tight in the paddock with. I don't know how many folks who would call Josef a super close friend necessarily. It's not a shot at Josef. I think it's got to be really tough when you are in a hyper competitive sport like this, that is so mano a mano, a little bit different, say, than like the NFL or the NBA, to be really close with someone. I mean, we saw that with the way the Bus Bros fizzled out.
And frankly, I mean, I don't mean to step on anybody's toes here, but like, it's okay if you're not friends. Hell, I actually enjoy it if there's a proper rivalry, like, because I mean, frankly, I saw this interview the other day, recording Tom Brady, of all people, talking about how, like, yeah, he loves Peyton Manning. They're good friends, but they only ever went out to dinner like twice in 23 years or something like that. And because, frankly, he just wanted to kick his ass, and he knew he had to run through him every single time. And, I think it's the same type of mentality that's needed. But, look, that's besides the point. But I will say this is that, I don't want everybody to be kumbaya. I love that Josef is passionate. I love the fire. He's fast. An angry Josef Newgarden is a fun Josef Newgarden to watch. I love that he cares about this so much that it affects him certain ways, and maybe very unhealthy ways. It's disturbing he can't do 30 seconds to talk with Kevin or all these other little sublets, and that's a big thing. But I guess I know you've got more to say, but I'll say, to cover these first two sublets, as there was no hunting down the attenuator issue. It's our jobs as a journalist are to get the facts straight and coordinate those to the masses and distribute it accordingly. You wanted to, any random person doesn't necessarily have to be a Josef Newgarden fan, could just be an IndyCar fan or a racing fan, or is probably sitting there going, well, if they got caught with that this year, I wonder, does last year's car have it? Boom, go to the museum, get the answer. You don't have to wonder anymore. Facts.
Exactly.
That's period. That full stop on that. As far as the push to pass, I think the thing, because I was sitting, 2 seats over to you on the same front row during the Josef Newgarden press conference a year ago. Look, one, I look at this, and it's not necessarily attacking him. Will Power made a statement. Scott McLaughlin made a statement. For whatever reason, maybe it's because he is viewed as the face of the sport. Maybe it's just because he was the winner at St. Pete. I don't know. But
he pressed the button more than McLaughlin did, and Will didn't at all. Yeah.
Yeah. But for whatever reason, he was given a special press conference to share a bunch of, I don't know, I have no idea, type of explanations, to paraphrase it. And I mean, you drive for the guy that owns the series that the rule book comes from. You've got people that are in data. Like, there's just so much to your point that didn't make sense. And so it felt like gamesmanship. It felt like a little bit of manipulation and gamesmanship. And it's oh, dang, we got caught, which is why, like, look, if Colton Herta has a competitive advantage, or Pato or Graham Rahal or any other random driver that you want to name from any other organization, when they find a competitive advantage, you're not going to talk about it. You're just going to continue to play the cards until other people catch up, right? I mean, it's as simple as that. And so, like, cool, other people other drivers were upset. Cool. I'm okay with other drivers being outspoken about something that's blatant like that and unfair, because they should feel that it was blatant and unfair, because at the end of the day, Josef and them got caught. So the stigma that the media is attacking this, and since the push to pass and whatever, no, you just made yourself an easy target by doing something that was frankly incredibly stupid and incredibly obvious and frankly of low integrity. And you got caught and you got called out on it. And frankly,
and maybe there's a chance. There's still, I think, a small chance, and I don't want to speak for you. I still think there is a chance that this was an honest mistake. But if it was an honest mistake, when you're talking about push to pass, there are just so many questions as to how that happened and how it lasted for so long.
Oh,
and how an honest mistake that happened in August of testing for the hybrid unit, how that stayed in the car, and how that also overlapped with Josef and his engineer completely misunderstanding a rule change that wasn't a rule change for the whole calendar, and how that wasn't ever checked by Tim Cindric and the rest of the organization, and how there weren't engineers that had a conversation, was like, so what's the best way you guys think to use push to pass on these starts and restarts, and then that conversation being like, what are you talking about? That didn't change. Did I miss something? There's just, if it wasn't,
there's so many firewalls, right?
Yeah.
And that's the reason.
There should be. And if there aren't enough firewalls to prevent that from happening, that's why there were questions asked. That's why drivers and teams were so fed up. And that's why several stories by me and you and so many other people were written asking these questions and pointing these out and relaying the frustrations of the rest of the paddock. Like it or not, when something this big happens, even take out the aspect of Roger Penske owning the series and the sport and all of that, like, this is still a big story with lots of tentacles and lots of unanswered questions outside of the conflict of interest question. And so this, especially coming into the 500, for a guy who'd won the 500 the year before, this was back last year, was going to be a big story. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry for Josef Newgarden fans who feel like people were overly critical or pushed too much, but these were the stories of the day, the week, the month. And I'm not going to not write stories of people who were critical of Josef and the paddock because it's unfair. This was telling the story of the moment in the IndyCar paddock of what people thought about this. And this was a sentiment that lingered on well past the month of May last year. For those of you who remember what Brian Herta said in the moments after Gateway last year, some of that still hasn't gone away. And I was the person who dug super deep into the restart last year at Gateway, where Josef applied some brake pressure at a moment where he was already driving much slower than normal on a restart, where multiple drivers and teams felt like he brake checked them and sent that reverberating back through the single file restart line that ended up ruining the chances for multiple drivers to go and win that race, including Will Power and Alexander Rossi, who I think both could have potentially challenged for that. again, this wasn't. I would have done this if I got the text messages that I had gotten in the hours after that race of saying, hey, you need to find someone that can show you the data of Josef there on that restart because he brake checked the field. If that had been the case, I would have done that for any other driver who was leading and eventually won that race. It just so happens that was Josef Newgarden, and push to pass involved Josef Newgarden, and the attenuator thing involved Team Penske. All of these big questionable things, outside of Andretti and the 500, which frankly I will readily admit probably didn't get covered as much as it deserved to. I think part of that is a product of the 500 being immediately followed by Detroit. I think some of that is exacerbated by the fact that Marcus Ericsson didn't win the race, and Kyle Kirkwood didn't win the race. I think that and the team wasn't willing to talk. There's when you don't know exactly what happened, and the team's not willing to come out and address it head on. I asked, the team and Rob Edwards multiple times, didn't want to say anything. Fair, understand. Team IndyCar and Doug Bowles released the statements that they did, but didn't want to address it head on and really give any sort of concrete explanation as to what happened. The drivers obviously weren't going to really talk about it more than the ways in which they did. But we covered what was there to be covered, and that was that. I do agree with some folks out there that feel like that wasn't covered as thoroughly as the things that have happened with Team Penske. I think it's a fair argument, and I won't argue. I won't dispute that. And hindsight's kind of 2020 in that, but I don't think outside that you can point to anything else that has happened in the sport over the last year and a half that have been truly controversial on track things that haven't involved Team Penske. That's the part of all of this, is that there are some folks out there that feel like we've been so critical of Team Penske and Josef when so many things that have happened that have been the biggest stories of this sport have frankly just involved them.
And the impact of the push to pass thing last year, let's not forget, and this is more macro than micro and focused on Josef, but it's more macro on the bigger picture of the fact of that's when, like it or not, Roger Penske owning the series, there was also conversations of right in the middle of the charter situation and charter negotiations. And there were so many things that were very fragile, let's say. I mean, I recall at Barber Motorsports Park when Newgarden had his Academy Award-winning press conference that we had a team owners meeting, team principals meeting if the owner wasn't present, at RP1 right there. And it was like an emergency meeting because there was so much disruption and turbulence throughout the paddock, because everybody was walking on eggshells and everything was fragile, because they're also trying to find ways to lock in a charter agreement to move the sport forward. Because guess what? If certain things don't happen and there's more dissension, that's what led to some really bad things 30 plus years ago.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's just the truth. And those are things that we as a sport are trying to stay away from. Yeah. So it's not being hypercritical of any one thing, but it just so happens that, as you pointed out, the one team that fits this bill right now and has committed multiple issues, the poster boy for him is Josef. I mean, right now. And so that's just the bigger microcosm of it. I think, I don't know if you had another point to make of the different things, but those are the things that come to mind. I know he's having a miserable year, and it'd be more fun if he was able to really get there and be in a championship fight with Palou and maybe do something that could rattle him, and that would be a hell of a lot of fun for all of us. But that's just not what's happening right now.
Yeah. So just the thing on the IMS Media Center, the IMS Museum, sorry, to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit. So the Monday after 500 qualifying this year, I was standing out on the Yard of Bricks talking to some drivers with another couple members of the media, and there had been rumors around the paddock that morning that some drivers let us in on that that initially turned out to be incorrect. But there was all this talk about how the starting line experience at the IMS Museum, remember the museum had just reopened for the first time in 18 months, and that starting line experience, so incredibly cool. And it was set up from the starting front row, with show cars from last year, and that it was shut down. And if you remember, the front row last year was a Penske sweep with Scott McLaughlin, Will Power, and Josef Newgarden. So there were all these drivers in the paddock, not understanding why that was closed down, and we were still 16 hours out from all the stuff that happened the afternoon and night prior on Team Penske. And so I and another reporter from the Associated Press heard that, and we're like, all right, well, we've got to go to the museum to figure this out. So when we walked over to another member of the media's rental car and drove over there, and while we were driving over there, started to think, you know what? First of all, I know that in my reporting on the reopening of the museum, that someone said that the cars in the starting line experience are show cars. Those are not cars specifically from in this instance, all of Team Penske's cars from last year. Those are cars that are meant to just be wrapped and rewrapped with whoever started on the front row in the most recent 500. And so I started to connect the dots and realize this all is just a big coincidence. And this exhibit was closed because they're trying to rewrap the cars for Robert Schwartzman, Takuma Sato, and Pato Award, so they can get them set for the rest of the week and have the front row of the cars that were going to start at the front for the Indy 500 that coming weekend. So that was why that exhibit was closed down. It didn't have anything to do with the attenuators on those cars, them all being Team Penske cars having something nefarious. But I and the other reporter started thinking, well, Josef's winning car from last year is in the Penske exhibit. And it is supposed to be the exact car that won that race. That car did not go and run another race. It was taken out of commission, and that car will never run again, as is the case for any Team Penske car that wins the 500. That car was ran one race in 2024 because Josef's car in 2023 won the 500. Team Penske, like a couple other teams in the paddock, makes a 500 only car. That's the only time that car ever runs. And so Josef's, because he won the 523, they made and built a brand new car for 2024 that debuted in the 500 and was retired after the 500. And that car was placed in the museum. If you go, and if you haven't been, you'll see winning 500 helmets from drivers in there that still have milk stains on them. Like, that stuff is very real. And so there was the expectation of this car is going to be the car with most, if not all, of the parts that won that race. And so I and the other reporter went right to the car, looked at the attenuator, and sure enough, it had all the same sanding and blending that had been inspected and caught the day prior. And we can't guarantee for certain, no one from the team has outright said that attenuator had been on the car and that it hadn't been changed out. I mean, I'm sure there was some, polishing or, buffing up just to make this car look as nice as possible. It's Penske after all. But it gave the appearance that this was not something that just appeared here at the 500. And we, there were more pictures that came out in the coming days from fans who had taken photos or videos at previous races, either in 2025 or 2024, that made it very clear that this was something that had been around for some time. And so, to those who feel like that was me and another person going on a witch hunt, that's just not, this is what journalism is. It is asking uncomfortable questions to get the answers. It is trying to think outside the box to investigate things and shed light to things that people don't want light to be shed to. And I know this is, we're talking about really small things in the bigger picture of the sporting landscape and the world at large. But I think that was a very fair and reasonable thing to have done. And frankly, it helped shed some light on how long this has been going. No, we were not trying to go and uncover something for the sole purpose of getting Josef's 500 win taken away. That's not what you do as a journalist, but you're trying to uncover facts, and we do what we do in part because we ask questions. We try to identify trends or parse through data. That you mentioned that story about Team Penske's woes that I wrote that was published Sunday morning. I stayed way too late in the media center on Saturday night, going through old historical Team Penske results to figure out when was the last time that they had 3 races without a podium. When was the last time that they had 3 races without a top 10? How long those drivers individually had gone without wins, et cetera, et cetera. And it's part of the job. It's thinking critically and asking questions and trying to get those questions answered. So again, felt like that was all fair. Let me look over this list of things. I mean, so generally speaking, I don't want to speak for everyone in the media, but I really think, for the most part, and I'll talk about myself included, there's nothing that I have written about Josef that I don't think it was fair or would be done again. Some of it's been critical. I very rarely dive into the opinion zone. There are occasions where I write columns, and almost all the time it is macro looks at the sport and where it's going or what's been going on. I don't feel like and don't remember ever writing a critical story about Josef at large. Frankly, I think one of the better stories that I've written is that one that you mentioned that I would encourage folks to go and read. Headline of it is Insider: Josef Newgarden doesn't want to be IndyCar's superhero or black hat, but he is. It was after a solo interview with Josef the day after he won his second 500, where I tried to get to the heart of this obviously was coming in the face of the push to pass stuff, and there were, as we've mentioned, drivers and team owners and folks in the sport who thought ill of Josef, didn't believe him, thought he was a liar, thought he was fake, all of these things. And he'd kind of been portrayed in some way as this black hat of the sport. He'd broken off his Bus Bros tandem with Scott McLaughlin, and that obviously caused a rift between the two of them and in that team in that previous offseason leading into that year. So there was all this being said about Josef and feeling like he was a little bit of a lone wolf and he was kind of out on this island by himself. And there were obviously people that didn't believe him or thought all of these things about him. And I asked him, so you have these folks in one side of the sport who don't like you and don't believe you. And you also at the same time are positioned and have been positioned for years as the face of this sport. You are the driver, as we said, for the winningest team. You've won 2 championships, and now you've won 2 straight 500s. Only 5 other drivers had won 2 straight 500s in the sport ever. And you are going to be in this Indy 500 media train now for a whole additional calendar year, something that I know took a lot out of Josef, asked a lot of him in late 2023 and early 2024, and was a little bit taxing for him, but it's kind of part of it. And so I tried to get to the heart of, asking Josef, do you see yourself as a villain? Do you see yourself as the face of the sport? Are you okay with the portrayal of either of those? And what I came away from it is that Josef understands the responsibilities that come from folks other than himself thinking and wanting him to be the face of the sport. And he does as much, if not more than anyone, from a partner and media availability standpoint. In fact, I think today he is doing a media event in Tennessee to help promote the season finale around where he's from. Obviously, a big race for him, and that race and the folks that are promoting it in the Penske world see him as an important part of that promotion game. And Josef is willing to do that. He does so many of those things more than I probably have an idea of. In times like this in the sport, I know he's going, there's probably every single week between now and the end of the year when we have these back-to-back stretches of races. Josef isn't just going from Mid-Ohio to his home in North Carolina and then going to Iowa. He's like this, like I said, he's got a sponsor appearance or a promotional appearance in between there that he's hopping around to. He does so much for the sport, but I know it's not something that is comfortable for him or something that if he had his druthers, he would necessarily do. And I'm sure there's plenty of drivers who don't necessarily like that side of it. There are also drivers who I think really relish in it, like Pato O'Ward, for example. They're just kind of built different. They're Pato has said he is kind of an extroverted introvert in some way, and I think that's fair. They're all drivers in the sport are made a little bit different, but I thought that was a really intriguing story and got some good answers. I'm not going to go through the quotes that Josef gave there, but I would encourage folks who are subscribers of IndyStar to hunt it down and read it. I think maybe just to close all of this off, if you think the media has been unfair to Josef, you are free to have your opinion. I think any instances where we have raised questions or asked tough questions or been critical of him or the team, I feel like it's been situations where journalists would be expected to do that. I also think for folks out there who think that we blamed Josef for the attenuator stuff, please show me the story or the tweet where that was said, because I don't think that ever happened. I did see some things where people felt like, we blamed Josef for push to pass, and then we blamed him for the attenuator stuff, and now we're blaming him and being hard on him for blowing the media off. That just never, ever happened on the attenuator stuff. Maybe I'm sure some fans did. There are plenty of anti-Team Penske fans out there or anti-Josef Newgarden fans out there. I'm not in tune with everything that's being said on social media, but I also don't think we should take shots for or be pooled in with folks, every single person that's saying anything about Josef Newgarden online. So I know that was probably a lot more time than that topic deserved, but I wanted to, I just felt like it became something that was so big that I thought it was important to try and do a little bit of a media education lesson, and also frankly, just kind of clear up some of the things that had been said. Many of those people, some of which who blocked me on social media may not be listening or likely or not listening to this podcast. So it may be falling on deaf ears, but it's still, again, as we have this platform, feel like it's an important thing to try to touch on. And hopefully, if you're still listening to this as we ramble on, it was productive and hopefully closes a book on something that I hope we don't have to talk about the rest of the year and really ever again.
Facts. Over it. I think we're all kind of over it. I think just briefly, as we put a bow on that, I want to end on a happy note. Let's end on a happy note. So we come up on Iowa, the only doubleheader on the calendar this year. And last year, a couple of challenging races with very little passing. It's quite honestly, even the drivers said that it was boring for them. And they wanted to fall asleep. So the track's still the same. The corners are paved. The repave in the corners still there, but they didn't touch the rest of the track.
And only one lane.
And only one lane. And even though there was a recent test there, not sure if we're in for more of the same. It kind of feels like we're going to be in for more of the same. Maybe there will be a little bit of help with tire combinations or something of that sort. I'm not entirely sure on that one. I haven't seen the release from Firestone yet to verify if it's the same. But that all said, Alex Palou has a monstrous, and I do mean monstrous, 113-point lead over Kyle Kirkwood in second, Pato 125 back, Dixon 125, or 148, I'm sorry, and Christian Lundgaard at 167. Your winners last year were Will Power and Scott McLaughlin. This is also a track where Alex Palou wrecked on his own, if we're being fair, in race one, and then came back and finished on podium in race two. So, I guess just briefly, how are we feeling about this weekend? If we're previewing this weekend, I feel like qualifying, this is going to be, even though you'd think qualifying mattered at Mid-Ohio, and we still saw people jump up anywhere between 8 and 18 spots, depending on where they qualified, which is kind of unique. But Iowa feels like it's cut from a different cloth based on last year. It feels like if you qualify in the top 5, there's a good chance you're going to finish there.
Yes. To talk briefly about Iowa, I don't know. This is necessarily a way to get to a happy note to end this podcast, because from talking to so many drivers as I did at Mid-Ohio for a story I plan to write tomorrow and will be published on Thursday morning at IndyStar.com, to get a sense of what they felt the package was going to be like and how that test went for folks that did that in between Road America and Mid-Ohio. As you said, it's going to be, I don't know that it's going to have a way to be anything but more the same. And it's really unfortunate. I'm not going to, this is not solely on the shoulders of NASCAR, but so much of this happened literally because NASCAR finally decided, after a decade or more of owning Iowa Speedway, that after Penske Entertainment and Penske Corp spent and maybe Hy-Vee some too, spent millions upon millions of dollars revamping and touching up the facility at large at Iowa Speedway and turning it into one of the nicer facilities, from the grandstands to the track in general to the infield facilities and the media center. The suites, just everything at that complex, I think is one of the nicer ones that we have on the IndyCar calendar. And they looked at that and looked at how great the short oval package, I think, had been operating for NASCAR with the next gen car. And the fact that they owned this track and maybe in some way, although certainly no one would ever admit this on the record, so that the IndyCar was having a little bit of success. And as the owners of the track, maybe wanted to take a little bit of wind out of their competitors' sails there. And so they go and ahead of 2024 decide that they want to have the Cup Series' first race there ever. And they do some testing and realize that the best thing for the Cup cars is to repave those corners. Again, I don't understand the Cup cars and the competition there well enough to totally understand exactly why that decision was made, but it's what was made regardless. And what it did was it made that low line the shortest way around that track to be so fast for IndyCar. When you have one lane that's paved and one lane that's not. When we talk about short ovals and we envision guys like Santino Ferrucci or Connor Daly, for example, running the high line and getting so much praise for doing that, that is allowed to happen when you have a restart where a track has been swept, but it's also a situation where tires have to have both enough grip and enough degradation to where you have maybe a slower car running the low line, and so a faster car needs to pop up to the high line to get around them. They have to have the trust in their car to be able to hold on up there, and it also has to be fast enough to where they can execute the pass. And the problem that we have now at Iowa Speedway with the bottom lane being paved in those corners is that even if you pop up to that high line, it is not easy at all for guys to be able to execute a pass. And so that's why you saw last year so few on-track passes for position, or passes really at all in general. You had so many instances of guys either coming upon cars that were about to be lapped or were lapped that were just almost impossible to pass. And so you saw this processional race that we saw two of last year. And the other aspect of that is that we ended up with a tire compound from Firestone that just didn't degrade. So you had guys that were running as fast, and maybe in some instances even faster laps at the end of their 50 to 60 lap stint than they were running at the start. And that was allowed to be the case because the car is getting lighter as it's burning fuel, and these tires just weren't falling off. And so guys had as much grip as they did at the start of the stint. And so you didn't have an instance, for example, of a great car having just more and better rubber underneath them, to where even if a slow car was hugging the low line, they could pop up and pass them. Those cars that weren't nearly as fast, just there was a small enough gap to where if a slower car is hugging the lower line, bopping up into that portion that's not been repaved and so doesn't have as much grip, when the tires aren't degrading, that slower car is just going to be able to be faster because they're on a grippier surface and running less distance, and so you just don't have passing. And from what I understand, unless something drastically changes, I don't think this has changed. There are some drivers, I think it was Pato Ward and Colton Herta, who went and did a tire test in the offseason at Iowa to try and come up with a compound that could bring some more deg. And there was a compound that those drivers tested that I know at least Pato Ward came away feeling like could have some promise. Again, in a story I write for Thursday Online, Pato gave me some very, shall we say, frank comments about that test and what was taken away and done and learned from it in the aftermath. And the long and short of it is he feels like Firestone in the series almost ignored his comments coming away from that, which were, I feel like this tire has enough deg that we could maybe possibly create a decent race. And I don't believe that's the compound that they ultimately have gone with. That test a couple weeks ago at Iowa had one instance of right front tire failure that sent Christian Rasmussen into the wall and had a really gnarly single car crash. I think the only reason we didn't have more crashes like that is because there were teams that were immediately noticing tire temp issues there on that right front, and they were basically managing it and not running and not pushing the limit to where there could be a chance where they could have that issue. So the long and short of it is, I think we're going to end up with a tire that does not degrade much, and therefore I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of passing. I know there's been work on the boost levels and the downforce levels that where there was some hope that some combination of changes there could produce some better racing or help also affect driver's grip or the ways in which the tires degraded. I think there's still potential that there could be some changes between what was experimented with at the test and what we'll ultimately see Friday, Saturday, and Sunday on track. But I did not get a sense from any driver I talked to over the weekend at Mid-Ohio that there is virtually any hope for either of these two races at Iowa Speedway to be good and enjoyable to watch and compete in. And that is really concerning for a track that hosts two of your 17 races on the calendar. And as recent as last year, at least had some buzz going into them with the the big concerts that IndyCar was hosting, and the big sponsor like Hy-Vee that was doing a lot of great off-track promotional stuff for you. I know the grandstands were never full, and frankly, a lot of the tickets and the butts and seats that we saw, I know for a fact were giveaways, and so there were not nearly as many ticket buying folks as it maybe appeared to be, but there were still, for whatever reason, a decent crowd, at least there at Iowa. And now I think a lot of those fans have either bought tickets to the NASCAR race and decided that's what they're spending their money on, or maybe they're going to Knoxville Speedway that weekend and spending their time there and watching that racing instead of going to Iowa Speedway, or just thinking that they would rather watch it on TV. And that's a real shame. What I will be doing with the rest of my afternoon after we finish up with this podcast here in a second is counting to see how many tickets have been sold. I did a little bit of that over the weekend while I was at Mid-Ohio, and it is clear that there have not been very many bought, and it's concerning a little about the future of this race. But hopefully we're pleasantly surprised and we get some decent racing here this weekend, and this race can continue to remain on the calendar. I'm not totally convinced that this is still a doubleheader next year, and that if the racing is not good, I don't know how long it will continue to be a part of the IndyCar schedule, and that's a real shame if that pans out that way.
Well, I guess today's opposite day because, Happy Note actually turned pretty grim pretty quick, but,
we tried. It's just it's real tough to spin that that's positively. Hopefully, in a week, next week, when we come on and talk about Iowa, there are some positive things that we can glean from that, and hopefully, I'll be so very happy to be proven wrong. I know we went into Gateway last year, feeling pretty negative about the state of IndyCar short oval racing with the extra weight of the hybrid, and that turned into be a pretty exciting race. And I don't think that this is a problem, as we saw at Worldwide Technology Raceway again this year across the board, that is a short oval problem. The races at Milwaukee last year were pretty good. Nashville was pretty good. So I don't think at least that this is a short oval IndyCar problem, but it may very well be an IndyCar at Iowa Speedway problem that may be pretty tough to fix, but we will see.
Yeah, simple as that. But maybe the restarts be a little bit more sense of urgency. I don't know. I'm trying to find some positives here. Maybe there's a positive if you're a Team Penske fan that they sweep the weekend and kind of get back on their horse. Maybe the championship closes up.
Yeah, maybe a guy like Kyle Kirkwood or Pato O'Ward wins race one of the weekend, and we're tuning into race two, seeing if they can sweep the weekend and actually turn this title fight into something. That would be great. I think those are, you mentioned it, seeing if Team Penske can turn their season around, seeing if Pato or Kyle Kirkwood can do some special stuff, or frankly, seeing if Alex Palou wins his first short oval ever. Those are all big things that I think we can at least have an eye on. And there's always drivers like Santino Ferrucci, Connor Daly, both of which who have never won a race before, who I think could potentially factor in. David Malukas, Christian Lundgaard, who's never won on an oval. There are drivers to watch, and there are things that could be exciting from a storyline standpoint this weekend. I just don't know that we will at least maybe quite see the level of excitement between the green flag and the checkered flag that was quite like Worldwide Technology Raceway. But again, happy to be proven wrong here in a couple days.
And with that, I think that we've put a very good bow on a very extended version of the Inside Line. You can find us on Twitter at @ByNathanBrown and at JoeyBarnes85. And with that, we look forward to talking with you next week.